welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, well, thanks for checking us out. You're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. It's a page where we try to do fun things with narrative. And what we do here on Tuesday nights is we read old folklore and fairy tales, some recently translated, some translated for a very long time. And we just try to, get what we can out of it. If you are watching this live, then there is a live chat there full of people that enjoy and discuss the stories, and you're welcome to join them and join in that discussion. And I check in with it here and there, but my focus, of course, is on reading stories. However, if you're not watching this live, you have the distinct advantage of being able to go down to the description below and click on one of the timestamps that will jump you ahead to whatever part of the show most interests you. And you may want to do that this time, because we're going to spend about 10 or 11 minutes in the beginning here addressing a sort of question that has come up a few times in the stream, which is, why is the Wikipedia for the Huldre the way it is? I did some digging in my week off sick, and I have answers. They're not short answers, so they will take 10 to 12 minutes, and I'm going to do that. But after that, I'm going to read stories from Denmark about various what are called Barrowfolk. I think at this point, the title might have changed. It says mound folk, and that's just because I don't know if everybody knows what a barrow is anymore. And that seemed more friendly, I suppose. I'm just going to say hello to the chat, and then I'm going to talk to you about what I have discovered about Huldra. Tammy says, I was happy to hear Rory was doing a live stream tonight. I was happy to hear I was doing it too. To be clear, I probably could have done it last week, but I think, let's face it, 75 to 80% of the reason anyone's here is to hear my voice. And when I listened to my voice, it sounded terrible. It sounded painful and clogged with phlegm. And I was like, I don't want to hear a story from this. So I decided to take the week off on that account. GS likes the artwork. It's from an old version of 1001 Arabian Nights, apparently. Jump Store is here. Hello, Jump Store. Witchery is here. Hello, Witchery. I remembered the day to make sure Rory was alive. Yeah, I can't believe I've had 3 colds. It's more than I've had in the last 3 years in 2 months. Zombie Wolf says, glad Rory always does these openings so I can be a bit late and not miss anything. I mean, I know what you mean, but that might also indicate I need to get moving quicker. Witchery says, when I'm late, I listen on 1.5 times till I catch up. I think a lot of people do. And Uncle Kitty's here. Great. Because, Uncle Kitty, I'm about to answer a question of yours. Okay, before we get into the story today, which is going to be a series of stories, it's going to be told in a bit of a different way from Benjamin Thorpe's collection, Northern Mythology, specifically Denmark tales about trolls, barrowfolk, mound folk, that kind of stuff. I want to talk about the Huldre again, hopefully, I guess, for the last time to address, I'm going to call it controversy, but it's not even really a controversy, to address our confusion about why we have such a monolithic representation of the Huldre as being this seductress female in the forest, but then when we go to sources like Asbjornsen and Moe, who are kind of one of the most essential collections of Scandinavian folklore, then we don't see the Huldre portrayed that way almost ever at all, but portrayed in many other ways, like a community of sort of elf or fae. So I'm going to read for you. I asked this question first to Simon Roy Hughes, who does our translations of Asbjornsen and Moe and is pretty educated on the topic. I asked him, where is this coming from? Why can't I find this version of the Huldre that Wikipedia references and a bunch of other sort of folklore websites reference and then don't really cite a source on? Where is that coming from, and why does it not match up? And I'm going to read for you word for word Simon Roy Hughes' response here. because it's really interesting and it's not at all what I expected. So these are Simon Roy Hughes' words. It's complicated, of course. Andreas Faye, spelled Faye, who predates even as Bjornson and Moe, as pretty much the first like formal collector of Scandinavian folklore. And that's going to matter in a minute. Andreas Faye, the earliest Norwegian to write about the Huldre, begins by treating the woodland seductress, but admits there are Huldre men who tempt Christian girls and even Huldre couples, suggesting a community. And we're going to see that reflected in a bit of a source I have here. Sorry, I have a hair on my nose. Asbjornsen, in his foreword, follows Faye's lead, using she and her when talking about the Huldre. I would claim, that Simon Roy Hughes would claim, though, that none of Asbjornsen's Huldre tales include a stereotypical seductress of the forest wholly devoid of connection to similar creatures, and I certainly have never found one. There is obviously a society, and even when one of them is acting wantonly, which was my point, that it wouldn't surprise me to hear that there was a seductress, but to say that's the whole of the Huldre is to ignore all these stories we've read that make no reference to that. Carrying on with Simon Roy Hughes. Faye goes on to speak of Huldre weddings, then Huldre farms, which we'll see a reference to in a minute. He notes that the word hul comes from Old Norse, meaning cover or darkness, then goes into Norse literature, which is quite thin on the matter of subterraneans. He cites a saga, which mentions that a character told a queen the story of Hulda, with an A, not an ER. But if there ever was such a story, it is lost to us. And although there are up to 25 fragments of manuscripts of an 18th century reconstruction based perhaps on oral sources, we don't actually have the original. And that appears to be what there is. I don't know why Faye seized on the temptress image. I assume he didn't make it up, so it must have come from somewhere. As ever, I shall keep my eyes and ears open, but I fancy this is one of those tantalizing mysteries of folklore that will never satisfactorily resolve. So, it seems like Andreas Faye may have had access to a story in a more complete form than we have, and it's not too clear where that is or where they got it from, but I have a couple of other sources I want to read you guys. But before I do that, one of the things I did ask Simon Roy Hughes as well is I said, I see also on websites and stuff about folklore, about the Huldre, talking about holes in their back. And I said, I can't find that. And so he said, he has heard legends of Huldres with hollow backs. And the only one he had at hand, which I'm going to read you because it's very short, is Danish, which was what sort of spurred me on to find more Danish stories because I realized I didn't know a lot about Danish folklore. And this is the story that he shared. A man walked through a forest, and without his understanding wherefrom, a gorgeous maiden came to him. She was so lovely that he had never seen her like. It was about the middle of the day, and since the man had heard of the Hulderfolk, he had no doubt that she must be an owl maid. She spoke well for herself and attempted to lure him into the forest, but the man was too wise for her, and finally he said, "Turn around and let me see if you are behind as you are before." When she heard this, she went on her way, and now he saw she was hollow like a kneading trough in the back. So I thought, okay, that must mean that this sort of more narrow conception of the Huldre is something that came up more in Denmark than the sources I normally was reading, like Norwegian and a little bit of Swedish and a lot of Iceland. But we're going to look now at another source that discusses this same point, because it is one that is specifically referenced on the page, on the Wikipedia page, I believe, anyways, unless my memory's failing me. This is from where we're going to read our stories today, and it's from a section called Huldra or Halla, and this is from Benjamin Thorpe, sort of after Asbjornsen and Moe. In fact, he makes some references to him. He may have even been a contemporary of them, but he sort of publishes this late in the 19th century. Over the whole of Norway, the tradition is current of a supernatural being that dwells in the forests and mountains called the Huldra or the Hula. And by the way, this is where Wikipedia is getting a lot of its source from, is this opening paragraph. Stick with me, because if they kept reading, it would get more complicated, and you will see. She appears like a beautiful woman and is usually clad in a blue petticoat. By the way, he accredits this to Norway, and the only story I've found is from Denmark, so I don't know. And is usually clad in a blue petticoat and a white snood. I don't know. He doesn't have a story like this, by the way, in this collection. I don't know where this is coming from. It doesn't have a citation. I can see where Simon Roy Hughes is experiencing that frustration. She is fond of cattle, particularly brindled, of which she possesses a beautiful thriving stock. They are without horns. She was once at a merrymaking where everyone was desirous of dancing with the handsome, strange damsel, but in the midst of the mirth, a young man who had just begun a dance with her happened to cast his eye on her tail. So there we go, another reference to tails, which is not something we really see in Asbjornsen and Moe. Immediately guessing whom he had gotten for a partner, he was not a little terrified. By collecting himself and unwilling to betray her, he merely said to her when the dance was over, "Fair maid, you will lose your garter," and she instantly vanished, but afterwards rewarded the silent, considerate youth with beautiful presents and a good breed of cattle. So we don't really see her as a seductress here, despite that opening paragraph. The idea entertained of this being is not everywhere the same. That's just old world language for you. Sentence structure. But varies considerably in different parts of Norway. In some places she is described as a handsome female when seen in the front, but is hollow behind or else blue. Again, I've only ever found a Danish reference to this, but I'm sure it's around. And while in others, she is known by the name of Skogsnutsa, and is said to be blue but clad in a green petticoat and probably corresponds to the Swedish Skogsniva. Her song, a sound often heard among the mountains, is said to be hollow and mournful, differing therein from the music of the subterranean beings, which is described by ear witnesses as cheerful and fascinating. But she is not everywhere regarded as a solitary wood nymph. And here comes the important sentence: Huldre men and Hulderfolk are also spoken of, who live together in the mountains and are almost identical with the subterranean people. Hardangerfjord, the Huldre people in Hardangerfjord, the Huldre people are always clad in green, but the cattles are blue. Again, I've found no stories that do this, but I'll take his word on it. He was a collector of first primary source folklore. It may be taken when a grown-up person casts his belt over them. They give abundance of milk. The Huldres take possession of the forsaken pasture spots in the mountains and invite people into their mounds, where delightful music is to be heard, which is something I found in Icelandic and Norwegian. Now, here's where I think the most important line comes in. The belief in Huldra is very ancient. We read that as far back as the year 1205, the queen of Magnus Lagabator, I forgot to look up that pronunciation, when detained by an adverse wind in Bergen, having heard that the Icelander Sturli Thordsson was an excellent storyteller, desired him to relate to her the saga of the giantess Huldra, whose name appears to be derived from the Old Norse Holar Feidis and Propidis, which is all he says on the Huldra. And I think you can see Simon Royce Hughes' point here. Why do they focus on the seductress thing when they don't share tales much about that? They share tales about Hulderfolk and subterranean folk and Barrowfolk and so on, which he admits are pretty much indistinguishable. It seems a lot more likely that it was a collection of, it was the imagination of a fae world, if you will. But the reason why I say that last line is important is that tale, which we only know told secondhand through the Queen, which we don't actually really have any real sources for, is something that Simon Roy Hughes was mentioning. We sort of have pieces of, maybe is where this concept of the seductress female comes from. We don't really know what the story of the giantess Huldra really was, because we don't really have a source. And it's possible that they had a better source back then than we do now. Now, I have one more thing I'm going to say, and then we'll get on to the stories. See if I've lost everyone yet. Another common theme in the horror movies is that if you cut off her tail, she has to marry you. We're going to see a version of have to marry you, but it's not that. Okay. I'm going to read you the one story he actually describes in this book in detail called Huldra Marriage. So it's about marriage. And you're going to notice that it doesn't fit anything he just said. Which, I don't know, you make of it what you will. I'm not saying he's wrong. Obviously, this Benjamin Thorpe has way more credibility around folklore than I do, but it just seems weird to say this description of the Huldra and the Hula and then just not offer any actual tales of it that reflect that. But the marriage thing here is very interesting because that is would be the point of a seductress, right? This is a short tale, so if you want to skip it, you feel free. A content warning here, this does involve spousal abuse. It is framed as such. So if you want to skip it, I would say maybe do something else for about 3 minutes. So let me read our first story, which is not about Danish trolls, but will demonstrate the variety of ways the Huldre get portrayed and why this topic is... let me be clear, I guess, one more time. My point isn't that the Wikipedia is wrong in that, and I never was, that it was a seductress female. I couldn't find any tales of it, but I could easily believe that to be one of the Huldre because they are that way. They are sort of as deceitful as they are helpful kind of things. They're the wilds. However, what I didn't like and what I don't like and what I feel is well established here is the idea that that is the main representation of them when we have, just in terms of reading on this stream, we've seen so many examples of stories that make zero reference to that version of it and still frame them as Huldre. It is related that an active young fellow in Norland, by laying the barrel of his rifle over a Huldre in a forest, got her into his power and made her his wife. Oh, hey, look, she's not the seductress. They lived happily together and had a child, but on a sudden, as the child was one evening playing by the fireplace where the Huldre was sitting and spinning while the man was at his work, something of her savage nature came over her, during which she said to her husband, alluding to the child, that it would make a capital roast for supper. Well, the man was horrified, and the woman, who was conscious that she had grievously committed herself, changed her tone and begged her words might be forgotten. But they were not. The man bore them in remembrance. The horrid sounds rung incessantly in his ears. He perceived in them a proof of his now no longer blooming wife's real nature, and their domestic peace was at an end. From being a good man, he became morose, frequently upbraided his wife with her diabolical proposal, cursed the hour when he resolved on marrying her, beat and ill-used her, and thus it continued for a season. The woman suffered and repented, and one day she went to the smithy to see with a friendly eye her husband at his work. But he began as before, and on its coming to blows, she, by way of proving her superior strength, seized an iron bar and twisted it round her husband as if it had been a wire. The husband was now forced to submission and to promise domestic peace. So, you know, a reasonably happy ending given how it starts. But here we have not a seductress. We just have a person who is sort of trapped in a marriage and abused for it, has magical powers, is framed as a Huldra. So it's not just the seductress, right? Like, I feel like that's the only thing I really need to stay here. So at least we have some source on where that imagery is coming from, and it's not surprising to me that there are Huldra that would behave that way, forest seductress spirits. I mean, that's very in keeping with the way that fae get represented in folklore. But I think It's still inaccurate on the Wikipedia page to pretend that that is the main representation of Huldra. I have shown, based on very reliable sources for this kind of stuff, as Bjornson and Moe, Benjamin Thorpe, so on, that they were more diverse in their remembrance by the countrysides that word had prominence. Yeah, everyone's happy about her bending a wire around him. Me too. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, hopefully that was interesting enough for people, and hopefully that provides some insight for you, Uncle Kitty. You were in my thoughts as I was running around the internet trying to figure out where this was coming from. And many thanks to Simon Roy Hughes, which, by the way, I will, if I remember, put his books in the comments for helping me out there, for giving us all such valuable information from a lifetime of experience and knowledge. But this whole thing got me thinking, I hadn't really done any tales from Denmark. So I want to read some Danish traditions because, well, it is Scandinavian and it has similar casts of characters. It has its own textures to it. So give me a second. I'm going to drink some water. Maybe give my nose an itch because it is itchy today for some reason. And then we are going to read about what I would call sort of the Danish equivalent of a subset of Hulderfolk, but that's kind of controversial. You could more accurately call them the Subterraneans or the Barrowfolk, the Trolls, and the Elves. And you'll see what I mean. They kind of blend them all together. By the way, if you guys don't know, I realized I've never explained this, and I do try to make the assumption that my audience is new to all of this kind of stuff. Sometimes I call it Norse, sometimes I call it Scandinavian. For our purposes, you can use those pretty interchangeably. Norse basically just means northern people, and Scandinavia includes Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and arguably some other regions. I don't know how confirmed it is, but I think the Netherlands falls into Scandinavia, but if it doesn't, I'm going to make some people mad. You'll notice that this includes northern Germany, and there's definitely some relationships there. I don't know if you would call northern Germany Scandinavia. I've never heard that happen. And whether you want to call Iceland and its distinct versions of Norse myths a Scandinavian or not, I mean, most people do, but that's kind of up to you, I guess. These things are the boundaries on things are a little more fuzzy. But roughly speaking, Norse and Scandinavian can be seen as interchangeable for our purposes here because we're not dealing with anything too finely defined. So if you're wondering, that's what we're doing. And I'm going to focus in on the Danish traditions, which is Denmark, the Danes, today, because I don't think I've ever read anything specifically Danish before. So, after all of that, tonight's stories are going to be a little bit different. This doesn't really give each tale a title. Instead, it chooses a topic, and then Benjamin goes through and relates to you several tales, some longer, some shorter in a row, about that topic. And I'm just going to read that section, which means we're going to kind of go through a collection of little minis tales and longer tales about Danish Barrowfolk. Oh, Finland, right. Forgot to mention Finland. Okay. Tonight's tales comes to us from Benjamin Thorpe's Northern Legends. Northern Mythology, rather. Which is a collection that you can find yourself online for free because it is from the turn of the century, effectively. And we are going to read a series of tales in a row about trolls, the subterraneans or barrowfolk or mount folk, and elves, and even to some extent dwarves. They're sort of muddy in their definitions. Yeah, we're just going to read a series in a row. It's going to be a little bit different. Feel free to join in the chat if you are here live and comment on it. And our story tonight opens up with an account of the origin of trolls, or Huldre, or just adjusting the sound here. The people in Jutland relate that when our Lord cast the fallen angels out of heaven, some of them fell down on the mounds or barrows and became barrowfolk, or as they are also called, mount folk, hill folk. Others fell into the elf moors, who were the progenitors of the elf folk, while others fell into dwellings, from whom descend the domestic spirits or the Nisr, which we've talked about in Germany, but we won't talk about today. Now that is one account of where they come from, and the second one is, well, Eve, of Adam and Eve in the Bible, was one day washing her children by a spring. Our Lord unexpectedly appeared before her, whereat she was terrified and concealed those of her children that she had not yet washed. Our Lord asked her if all her children were there, and she answered yes, to avoid his anger. If he should see that they were not all washed, then said our Lord that what she had concealed from him should thenceforth be concealed from mankind. And at the same moment the unclean children disappeared and were concealed in the hills, and from these descend all the underground folk. And then he adds in a footnote here, in rabbinic tradition, it is said that after Adam had eaten of the tree of knowledge, he was accursed for 130 years. During all these years, we are informed by Rabbi Jeremias ben Eliezer, who procreated only Skedim, or demons, and the like. I find that interesting because I've never really seen an account for it. We carry on. We will get to tales, but he carries on, and I think these are interesting. Telling us about a little bit about the elf folk now. The elf folk dwell in the elf moors. The male appears as an old man with a broad-rimmed hat. The female elf is young and seducing in appearance, but behind she is as hollow as a dough trough. So we see that theme again. Young men should be particularly on their guard against her, for it is difficult to withstand her. She has, besides, a stringed instrument, when she touches which she infatuates every heart. The male is often to be seen by the elf moors basking in the sunbeams, but if anyone approach him too near, he will stretch his jaws and blow on them, which causes sickness and pestilence. The females are most frequently to be seen in the moonlight, when they dance their circling dance in the high grass with such lightness and grace that they seldom get a refusal when they offer a young man their hand. Good care must be taken to prevent cattle from grazing where the elf folk have been, for if an animal come on a place where they have either spat or done worse, it will be seized by grievous complaints, which can be remedied only by giving them to eat a handful of St. John's wort, gathered on St. John's night at 12 o'clock. It may also happen that when they receive injury by mingling with the elf folk's cattle, which are particularly large and of a blue color, such are sometimes to be seen in fields licking the dew from the grass, for it is on that they live. The peasants may, however, provide against the evils above mentioned if, before he lets his cattle loose, he goes to the elf barrow and says, "Thou little trow, may I graze upon my cows on thy mount?" And if he gets no refusal, he may feel easy. Between Tirlose and Sabjerg Banke, which is the richest barrow in all Sealand, it is in fact impossible to tell the precious things to be found there. In this hill there dwells a troll wife, to whom there was once a grand procession from Steen Lilyfield when the troll in Gultebjerg took her to wife. It often happens in fine weather that the passerby sees the most beautiful copper utensils and choicest beddings lying on the mound to be aired, and on approaching it still nearer, he may see the young elflings laboring to get them all in with the utmost speed. So now you see the rhythm of it. This is going to be me recounting several tales of elves and trolls and subterranean folk. Some are a little more involved and some are merely passing passages. In Ilerup Field, near Kalundborg, there is a mount called Fiberbage, in which there is a vast number of trolls who have much property and gold there. And it may be plainly seen that they have a hole in the mount through which they can drag those on whom they seize. At Yule, one may see how they bring out their silver and gold to sun it, at which time it is dangerous to go on the mount. But on St. John's night, the entire mount is set on red pillars, and then dancing and merrymaking may be seen there at this time. Anyone may approach, and may also see how they drag great chests full of money backwards and forwards. In Lunahoy Arrow, the troll folk may frequently be heard slamming their coffer lids. Some harvest people once sitting on the mount at their repast heard by placing their ear to the earth that they were grounding corn in it. That's one of my favorite ones. It's so specific and just unmoored. It doesn't have any particular context. That mount folk formerly dwelt in Galahoy on Arrow, there can hardly be entertained a doubt, for not only have people heard them slam their coffer lids, but the smith in Lilarisa, who in the war time kept watch there, heard every morning a clock strike 5 in the mount. Near Ustro, between Alberg and Tistu, there is a mount in which there dwells an elfin smith, and at night one may plainly hear that smith's work is going on in there. And in the side of the mount there is a hole by which in the morning slag and flakes of iron may be found. In the neighborhood of Sundby, on the Isle of Moor, there is a mount inhabited by a troll who is a smith. At night one may hear when he is at work. Opposite to this mount there is a sand hill, where the same smith has another workshop, whence may be heard the strokes of ponderous hammers. And at midnight he often rides through the air from one workshop to the other on a horse without a head, with hammer in hand, followed by all his apprentices and journeymen. Why does this horse have no head, I wonder? In the parish of Boor, there are 3 large mounts. In one of them dwells a troll who is a smith and has his workshop there. At night fire may frequently be seen issuing from the top of the mount. And, singular enough, entering again at the side, but it is by that means he keeps his iron hot. If anyone is desirous of having a piece of iron forged, he needs only to lay it on the mount, together with a silver skilling, and at the same time saying what he wishes done. The next morning the skilling will have disappeared, and the piece of work desired will lie ready and well executed. Once some of the country people of Bur determined to dig up this troll's treasure, and it is one of our more substantial tales of their journeys in doing so. For which purpose they one night assembled with spades and pickaxes, after all had been informed that they must beware of uttering even a single word. However strongly they might be tempted, they set to work, which is a thing we've seen in both Norse, German, and Icelandic. Don't speak. Bets in chat if you think someone's going to speak. Still they dug on unconcerned in the most perfect silence until they arrived at a spacious stone apartment. There lay the treasure before them, to wit a large copper kettle full of gold money, close by which was an enormous black dog asleep. One of the men then taking off his coat laid the dog gently upon it for the purpose of carrying him away. At this moment there came a great load of hay out of the mount, drawn by 2 cocks, which drew their load thrice round the mount. Still no one uttered a syllable until one of the cocks kicked out behind with such force that he broke the thick pole of the wagon, at which one of the men exclaimed, "That was a deuce of a kick for a cock!" But scarcely he had said the words when all the men, many as they were projected a considerable distance out of the mount, which was instantly closed again. On making a second experiment, it seemed to them that the whole Ustabur was in flames, at which sight, casting away their spades, they ran to their several homes, but on reaching the village they found all safe and quiet. He adds this note, which I find interesting, which is, in these, goblin smiths may evidently be recognized the descendants of the dwarfs of Eddic mythology, which is where we get most of our Norse myth. Jump story like that line. I did too. Drop that in a conversation. See what people say. At Gamtofte, not far from Essens, there is a mound in a field in which a troll is said to have taken up his abode. Of this troll, it is related that he is very obliging when persons wish to borrow anything, on which occasion it is simply necessary to go to the mount, knock thrice on the north side, at the same time naming things required, whether pots, pans, or other domestic utensils. And when they instantly get what they need, but may be reckoned as dead, if they do not return them at the time fixed. On the Isle of Moen, there is a mount called Ustahøy. Once when Margaret Skelvis was passing it on her way to Elmeland Castle, an old woman met her and asked, "Whither art thou going, my child?" Margaret answered that she was going on her way to Elmeland Castle to borrow a gown of Peter Monk's wife to be married in. Then said the old woman, "If thou wilt be here on Saturday, I will lend thee a bridal dress." And on the Saturday following, Margaret went accordingly to Ustahøy. And the old woman brought her beautiful clothes of gold embroidery, ordering her to bring them back in a week. If then no one appeared to receive them, she might consider them her own property. Thus did Margaret Skelvis appear as a bride in clothes of gold embroidery, and when she took them back at the time appointed, no one was there to receive them, and so she rightfully kept them as her own. These are, just as a little editorial notes, my favorite stories in folklore, because what does that mean? That's the best part. It sets the imagination alight. It doesn't carry me through, doesn't hold my hand. It says, here's a weird thing that happened. What do you think? In Tuholm, there is a series of lofty mounts which were formerly inhabited by the mount folk. A peasant once passing them on his way to... Let's double check that pronunciation. Vestavy Market, happened at the moment to utter complaints that he was mounted on such a sorry jade. On his way back, he saw lying precisely on the spot where he'd sent forth his lamentations 4 horseshoes, which he took home and shod his horse with them. But from that time no other horse in the neighborhood could go with such speed as his. Another time, some peasants were passing by the mounts by way of a joke, prayed the mount folk to give them some good beer. And at the moment a little troll came out of the mount with a large silver can, which he held out to the men, one of whom had no sooner got it in his grasp than he set the spurs to his horse with the intention of keeping it. But the little man of the mount, being quicker than he, soon overtook him and compelled him to give the can back. At length these mount folk grew weary of their abode in Tuland, and one day departed in a body to the ferry for the purpose of crossing the fjord. This is a particularly interesting point to me, because I read a story about the mound folk leaving Norway for Denmark once. This was a long time ago. And if I'm understanding this correctly, it seems to be implying the other direction, or maybe it's just a fjord within Denmark. When the ferryman was to be paid, they threw something into his hat, which burned through it, sank under the floor, which must have been gold, for otherwise it would have been impossible to account for the comfort which afterwards prevailed in the ferry house. A little elf girl once came to a man in Dunkirk. Here's the thing I like about this word. It sounds like a bad Scottish accent of somebody saying don't care. Dunkirk. On the Isle of Arrow, with a peel, the handle of which was loose, begging him to fasten it, which he refused to do. Whereupon a lad, who was standing by, undertook to assist her, and in reward for a service found lying by his plate at dinner time a dainty slice of fine bread with butter on it. The man, who well knew whence the present came, advised him not to eat it, saying it would cause his death, but the lad ate it without fear, and was well and cheerful when he arose the following morning, but his friend lay stone dead in the bed next to him. In the neighborhood of Lyng, near Soro, there is a mount called Bordis, not far from which dwelt an aged peasant who had an only son, who made long voyages. For a considerable time the father had received no tidings of his son, and thinking that he had perished, mourned for his loss. One evening, as he was passing by Boris with a full load, the mount opened, and the troll came out, who desired him to drive in. At this, the man felt somewhat disconcerted, but knowing it would not turn to his profit if he refused compliance with the will of the troll, he turned his horses and drove into the mount. There the troll began to deal with him, and paid him liberally for all his wares. And when he had unloaded his wagon and was about to drive out, the troll said, "If thou canst keep thy mouth shut with regard to what has taken place, I shall look to thy advantage hereafter. And if thou wilt come again tomorrow, thou shalt find thy son here." At the first moment the man knew not what to answer, but believing that the troll was able to keep his promise, he felt extremely glad, and at the time fixed to returned to Boadus. There he sat waiting for a considerable time, and at length fell asleep, and when he awoke, his son was lying by his side, and both father and son found it no easy matter to say how all this had come to pass. The son now related how he'd been in prison, then there suffered great hardships, but that one night he had dreamed that a man came to him and said, "Dost thou still hold thy father dear?" And on his answering yes, it was as if all chains and walls were broken. During this narrative happening to raise his hand to his neck, he found that a piece of the iron chain still remained there. At this they were struck dumb with amazement, and went to Ling, where they hung the piece of chain up in the church as a memorial. Not far from Soro is the village of Petersburg. A little beyond that, which is another called Ling, which we were just talking about. Between these two places is a mount called Brondhai, which is said to be inhabited by troll folk. Among these there was an old jealous troll, on whom the others had bestowed the name of Kunora Moa, which means grumble, apparently. And you can kind of hear it more in the original Danish accent, which I'm not achieving. Because through him there was often dissension and ill feeling in the mount. It once reached the ears of this old Kunora Moa that there was too close an intimacy between his young wife and a young troll, which the old troll took so much amiss that he threatened the life of the other, who consequently deemed it advisable to flee from the mount, and betake himself, transformed into a yellow cat, to the village of Ling, under which form he ingratiated himself with a poor housekeeper named Platt. With him he lived a considerable time, got milk and porridge every day, and lay from morning till night in the easy chair behind the stove. One evening Platt came home just as Puss in his usual place was lapping some porridge and licking the pot. "Well, mother," the man said, "I will now tell thee what happened to me on the way home. As I was passing by Brunhai, a troll came out and called to me, saying, 'Holla, you, Platt! Tell your cat that Conora Moore is dead.' At these words the cat rose on its hind legs, let the pot roll, and said, 'Meh,' while stealing out the door. 'What? Is Conora Moore dead? I must then hasten home.'" Jumpstore says, "I'm waiting for this plot to become an anime." That is what it gets a little more, a little less into that. That's where I've chosen to end it, I guess I would say. But as you can see, part of the reasons I haven't read Benjamin Thorpe before is because it is sort of just a long list of tales around a theme, and I understand that can be a little hard for people to wrap their head around. But there is actually quite a few stories in here that I would like to read to you, so maybe we will continue this. In terms of what we covered tonight, well, we covered a lot more than we normally do, didn't we? Normally I just aim to tell a story, but tonight we talked a little bit about the Huldre. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of give what I think is a little more encompassing idea of the Huldre, which is it doesn't really matter how you want to define them in the specifics, because that's not really what they seem to represent. We talked about this in the esoteric world of the Hulderfolk, which I, back in January, I guess I did. But the point of them is they're on the wild side. They're sort of that which stands in opposition of society. And I'm sort of taking a bit from Simon Roy Hughes' ideas, but I think I didn't need that conversation really to recognize who they really were just from reading these tales. They are imprecise by design because they kind of just represent nature, either our internal wildness, the kind of thing that would say, why don't we roast the baby? But may just as likely be given over to passions of love or want to do great kindness for no obvious reason. Like, it's that wildness, the chaos. And they stand sort of in opposition on the other side, to take Simon Roy Hughes' analogy, on the other side of the thatch fence on the borders of the farm. I think the greatest favor that can be done there is to not apply too restrictive of a definition on it, because it was never really there to describe a taxonomy of the world. It's not there to describe like we might describe a cow. It's there to give cultural material to sort of hang our own ideas about nature and wildness and instincts on. And so I think probably the reason why it originally bothered me the way it was defined is it was so narrowly defining a concept that was so broad in its use in folklore. And I think that's all I'm really trying to settle. I'm not trying to be pedantic. GS found these stories very animated. I agree. I think there is a sort of good pace to them. Witchery says sort of what I'm trying to say. The Fae shouldn't be comprehensible anyways. For the same reason why, gods and other figures of myth aren't, which is they're there to sort of be clay for impressions of our own thoughts about the world. The one way, the memories, the way that the Fae would be regarded by a farmer in the 18th century is going to be markedly different than the way we regard Fae nowadays. The Fae then sort of represented, yes, the mystery, but also the fear of the wilds, that, someday people just go walking into the marshes and never come back, and you don't know why. Whereas for us, it's a sort of romantic calling back to a past of a world that wasn't fully understood and wasn't so fully described, and so there's romance in it. And that's what I mean by it's like cultural material. It's not meant to be rigid. GS says Rory doesn't want to admit he's married to a Huldre. Well, they are stronger than me. So, maybe. Zombie Wolf is talking about how English speakers have an easy time learning German. I agree with that. The hardest language I've ever tried to pronounce or even read was really Icelandic. You would think it would be the Japanese, but Japanese is actually a pretty efficient language, I guess would be the word I would choose. So as much as it is very foreign to an English speaker in how it uses symbology and stuff, I didn't find it that hard to pick up on, but Icelandic I lost in. And yes, of course, Zombie Wolf's trivia. Zombie Wolf says Finnish is a Uralic-based language, but the other Nordic countries have language is rooted from the North Germanic language, which would eventually evolve to Norse. Oh, interesting. I did not know that. Zombie Wolf says scroll up for my trivia. I don't need to scroll up. I can see most of the chat at once on my screen. Well, I'm sorry if I missed any questions in there. I'll do a quick skim. Jumpstore says we have a group of people who live in the mounts. What shall we call them? How about mount folk? Yeah, why complicate it? All right. I think there was a question about the dog laws in Germany earlier in the stream. I wasn't specifically going to go and ask Jürgen Hubert. I was just hoping if he'd watched the stream, he might have answered it. If he watches this one to this point, I assume most people tune out once I finish telling the stories, but if you watched it to this point, Jürgen, they want to know why it's apparently illegal to neuter dogs unless it's medically necessary. Is that the question as I understand it? Oh, somebody is not well? Oh, I see. Tammy said I had to take a couple of minutes for my fur baby Zuka. She's not feeling good today. Well, I hope she feels better. The only other Uralic-based language is Estonia. I should also say, I feel remiss if I didn't mention this. As much as the Scandinavian countries have a ton in common, what their folklore is full of is villainizing each other. I mean, not entirely, but like, if you read a bunch of Norwegian folklore, not from Esbjornsen and Mo, who doesn't seem to get too much into this, but some of the other stuff around the time, it's about the terrible Finns. And then the Finns have stuff about, you know, the terrible Nords and yada, yada, yada. Anyhow, it is good to be back. I'm glad to have my voice back. Here's hoping I don't get sick again. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Zombie Wolf, Witchery, Uncle Kitty, GS, Tammy, Jumwolf, Jumstore, and hopefully no one else. And hey, if Genera, if you watch this off your off hours, because I know you're working, thank you for watching. As for me, I will keep the fire warm. You have yourself a good sleep.